Hello everyone and welcome to Sinful Gaming. I am Dad Hammer and I thought I'd have a little bit of a discussion about Warhammer the Old World. We've just got our second little reveal thing from them, from Games Workshop, Forge World in particular, and that's the map, some cartography of the Old World. And so with that out, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what we know, what little we do know, and sort of run through that this may be what everyone wants, this may be something different to what you envision it to be, this may be something completely left field, we really don't know. So I'm going to try and come at it from a few different points of view and just try and analytically think my way through what I think is more likely to happen than what is more likely to not happen. And so let's start off with, what do we know? The original trailer, teaser they put out was everything comes around again, even squares. And so that was the initial teaser. And so everyone jumped on going, oh, what is this? What is this thing? And it ended up being that Forge World, the guy, I forget his name and I'm sorry, in the original video was the head of Forge World. And he was talking about what if there was a Warhammer 30k equivalent for Age of Sigmar. So what he wanted was, for what 30k is to 40k, he wanted something to be to AOS, and that is Warhammer the Old World. So for those who've not seen what Warhammer the Old, or Warhammer Fantasy was, or Warhammer the Old World as it will now be called, in whatever iteration of game that might be, Warhammer Fantasy is effectively the precursor to Age of Sigmar. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of years between the two games, but they are tied in narratively, and a storyline does exist between the two on how we got to Age of Sigmar. What you think of that, completely irrelevant in this subject, and not the point. They do continue on the storyline, whether you like it or not, besides the point. And so that's the idea of this, to take back to the Old World and talk about this. So that was the initial piece we got. They had a logo designed in the initial one, and they gave us a 2 to 4 years more likely release date. So that was the initial reveal. We've now recently seen this cartography map of the Old World, and in particular just the Old World. There is nothing else. There's a bit of Bretonnia and Athlor and stuff in there, but you don't see much else besides that Old World. The Empire as well, obviously Sylvania and that sort of stuff. So there's a few things to take away from this and what we're looking at here. So the first is, we know square bases were hinted. We have not been exactly told that square bases will be the thing in it. It's probably an educated guess and probably on the money that square bases will be the way the game goes. Now, in what version of square bases, we'll get into that in a little bit. The game is going to be set in the old Warhammer Fantasy universe. Now, here's the interesting sort of part, is that the game is called Warhammer the Old World. And so for those of us who remember Warhammer Fantasy, the Old World is not what it was called. You had the Warhammer World and the Warhammer Universe, and as we now know, it's called Malice. But the Old World was a particular part of the old Warhammer Fantasy universe, which contained the Empire, Athlor, Sylvania, Kislev, and Bretonnia, as well as the Blight Marshes. And that was the Old World. So there's every chance that this game may not be Warhammer Fantasy, but may instead focus on the Old World in particular. And we may see expansions for this later down the line with other armies, but it's completely possible. The name of the game is Warhammer the Old World, and the Old World is a very particular part of the old Warhammer Fantasy universe. So there's that to consider, that it may not be the entire old fantasy universe. It may just be a part of it that we're looking at. That's just something to think about. Yeah, and so now going back to what I was talking about the games, there's been no mention at all that this will be fantasy in any way. We've had that they'll look at taking the best parts of rank and file games in their initial little chat, but what that might entail is up for debate. So rank and file games by nature are obviously games of blocks of troops that move around the table in rank and file. You might see more modern games taking this sort of approach to a gaming system, like Kings of War or the new I forget, the Song of Ice and Fire, etc. And Games Workshop has done multiple different rank and file games in the past. Not just Warhammer Fantasy, which is probably the most commonly remembered one, but also things like War of the Ring, which was a rank and file style game for the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game. In my personal opinion, one of the best rule systems Games Workshop has ever written. We've also had a game called Warmaster, which was a much smaller scale, sort of like a fantasy epic style game. And these were all rank and file games. Now, it could be very many things like that of any one of these particular concepts. It could be like taking bits from all. Warhammer Fantasy is the most traditional one, where every model is 28mm scale, or potentially maybe going to 32mm, which is what Games Workshop seem to be using a lot more recently. And just fantasy as we remember it. There's issues with this thought, but we'll get onto that in a sec. It could be like War of the Ring, where maybe they're intending us to be able to use the older models from the Cities of Sigmar range and Seraphon and Skaven ranges, even our Age of Sigmar models in Warhammer the Old World that fit into the universe back then, and putting them on round movement trays in a square block, somewhat like War of the Ring or a Song of Ice and Fire. And then there's potential that Warmaster, and a lot of people do seem to be going for this particular approach, which is a miniaturized version of the game, and that's like an interesting point of view to have. Now, interesting point on this is we've got a 3 to 4 year timeline on the game. This means that very little is planned. I've seen game development in different ways before in my own life and experience, and you don't take 3 to 4 years just to write a rulebook. That means there's models that need to get processed. There's a lot more planned for this than just some rules. Now, Games Workshop always prides itself as being a models company before a rules company. The game just happens to be using their models. So it's every bit potential that we're going to see a different scale, maybe to try and make people buy new models. Because at the end of the day, that's what they're going to sell. They're not going to sell a book that, like, it just doesn't make sense to sell a book that allows you to use models you already own, because then the game doesn't make any profit. Like, you've got to be selling stuff to make this profit and make the game worth investing in for Games Workshop. So this is why I think the Warmaster idea does have some merit. I personally would like to see a larger scale game, but I do see the merit in like the idea that Warmaster might be a thing. Now, we could get like the 28-32mm scale models. And that would be really cool. If we did get this particular way, I think we'd see something very much like the Horus Heresy style releases, like maybe a character series, and that would be really cool to see, like a lot of those old characters reimagined in like some of the amazing sculpting work that Forge World have done. It'd be really cool. However, it potentially, like, you have people just using old models, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do that. Like, I'm really excited for Warhammer the Old World. Make no mistake about this, and I'm sorry if this video seems to be looking unfavorably on this or anything. I'm really excited. I played Warhammer Fantasy for many, many, many years. It was my introduction into the hobby. I remember picking up my first Skaven models. But yeah, I think there's a lot more to be thinking about with this subject than just this is going to be fantasy brought back. It most certainly is not going to be fantasy as it was brought back. As much as it pains me to say, fantasy did die for a reason. It wasn't selling, it wasn't progressive, it wasn't doing anything for the company. They had to rejig it completely and start afresh. So we'll keep up to date with all the stuff of Warhammer the Old World on the channel because I'm really excited. I really hope that it's a good game, it has great models, and it can be something else I can play. It will never be my main game, and we'll get into the reason now why, because it's going to be a Forge World release. Now, Forge World do not release models as steadily as Games Workshop do, or Games Workshop main do. So expect this to be much more of a sort of Horus Heresy style release schedule. We might see a new army every year or something like that. We're probably not going to get a very high release rate of models or things for this game, which is why potentially the Old World might be all they explore. Been chatting, there's been a lot of chatter on the Facebook groups and Twitter and all that stuff about maybe it's the time of the Three Emperors, and it's going to be like civil war in the Empire, which would be like quite a cool way to do this. Or there's also been chatter of maybe they're going to explore different historical times throughout the Old World, and we'll get models released as these historical times pop up and are visited. Again, quite cool. But yeah, we don't know much at the moment. There's a lot of speculation, and there's a lot to think about, and it's worth keeping an open mind. This is very unlikely to be exactly Warhammer Fantasy. It might have some parts of it taken and given to this new game, but yeah, it's worth keeping an open mind, thinking about this in a reasonable manner, and considering what Games Workshop actually needs to get out of this for this to be a game that works for them. So without further ado, we'll just leave it there. We'll wrap up. Thank you all for listening. If you have any thoughts or anything about Warhammer the Old World, leave them below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And thank you to all our channel's Patreons who support the channel. If you wish to become a Patreon to the channel, you can support it at Sinful Gaming on Patreon. And that will be all for today, so, folks. Thank you for listening. We'll see you all again real soon.